Hello, everyone. This is a really important episode. We're talking with Christian Harrison. He is the brother of Kasee Ann Woods, who was murdered back in the 1980s by Gary Ridgway, probably the most prolific serial killer in American history. We're talking about the death penalty today, so stick around. You don't want to miss this episode.
Welcome to the Your Mark on the World show with your champion of social good, Devin D. Thorpe.
This episode is made possible via the support of our sponsors, including Johnson & Johnson's Caring Crowd. Christian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It is an unusually, I'm accustomed to talking about serious issues on my show, for better or worse, but this is an unusually serious discussion, and I appreciate your willingness to join me to talk about this, given your personal connection to it.
Yes, thank you.
And I realize that it's probably fair to say you don't speak for all similarly situated people, but your perspective on the death penalty as a family member to a murder victim is interesting. I wonder if we could just set the table, Christian. I hate to put this burden on you, and if you'd rather not, you tell me, and I can summarize the details. But if you would share your sister's story, I think that would help us understand the rest of the dialogue that we'll have today.
Yeah, so my sister Kasee grew up in a very dysfunctional and violent home, which was my home as well. But I was very young. She was older than I am, and she escaped that violence, that dysfunction by running away. She ran away a number of times, eventually landing in Washington State's foster care system. She was put into a group home. Surprisingly enough, I wasn't removed from the house, but Kasee was in the group home. At some point, just before she turned 16, the state of Washington decided that it would emancipate folks in the foster care system starting at their 16th birthday. My mom, to the day that she died, believed that happened because they were low on funds. My mom's not a politically savvy person, so I can't help but believe that it was probably more complicated than that. But the fact of the matter is that at the age of 16, my sister was turned out onto the streets. A few days later, as other statistics bear out, she was trafficked and became involved in the sex trade. And 6 months later, she was dead.
It's just a horrific story. It is heartbreaking to hear and to contemplate. Certainly, it seems like there is a lot of blame to go around for a miserable life, though certainly only one person can take credit for or deserves the blame for ending her life.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about Gary Ridgway. Certainly, you must be familiar with his story, having grown up and followed this case, because Kasee's murder wasn't solved for decades.
No, she disappeared August of 1982. Gary was not apprehended until 2001, almost 20 years later. And then he was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole in 2004. And he is now serving his sentence in a penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. And, at the time of his at the time of his sentencing, at the time of that trial, he was eligible for the death penalty, and prosecutors made the choice to take that off the table in exchange for information. And it was because of that choice that we learned that that Gary killed at least 71 individuals, including my sister. And that is horrific. It's remarkable. The interesting thing is that Gary was a target of the investigation from very early on, and then dismissed, if memory serves. And then, came back into the limelight. When my sister first disappeared, my mom naturally suspected that that her trafficker was to blame, and she held that that opinion for a couple of years, but that wasn't the case, and Gary actually confessed to Kasee's death. Sadly, the shallow ditch that he threw her body in and buried her was paved over by a strip mall sometime thereafter, and so the chance to recover her remains were lost.
Yeah. Yeah. I just can't imagine. I cannot fathom the pain that has inflicted on you and your family over, decades. Here she's been gone 35 years, and more than half that time, you wondered where she was, what had happened to her, and and never had the closure of being able to properly bury her remains. So, just kind of an unending misery.
I still remember walking into the kitchen the morning my mom figured out that her daughter had been killed, and she's just bent over the stove sobbing. You use the word closure, and I think that that's an important word. Aside from knowing, who killed her, why, and where her body was, anything else beyond that is, for me at least, not closure. It's simply more information, or a continuation of a process. I don't think closure really is possible. It's a spectrum, really. And the end of that spectrum is anchored in, the distant future, long after I'm gone and buried myself. And so I can't seek for closure. I can only strive for it, if that makes sense. Yeah. Closure's not going to come to me because of some external act.
This is a really important idea because it relates directly to where I think we need to take this conversation, and that is
yes.
in the direction of the topic of the death penalty. Because
yes.
so many people, especially in this case, have advocated for it. I think we all understand the logic of what happened. But so many people have advocated that there needs to be some way to undo the deal and to execute this person, Gary, and we probably shouldn't use his name anymore. Don't want to make him any more famous than he is.
Yeah.
But we don't want to, but so many people want to see him dead to bring closure. How do you feel about the death penalty?
My feelings on the death penalty have ebbed and flowed over the years. I've never been comfortable with it. But you know, your heart is drawn out towards victims in these cases. Um, and, and, and I think that that desire for, you know, a blood-soaked justice is natural. It is the mama bear instinct, the papa bear instinct. But we have to move past our instincts if we're to be more than just, you know, there was an anthropologist who called humans naked apes. If we're ever to move past the situation or the place we are in history where we're simply really advanced animals. Yeah, I've changed my mind, or my mind has evolved on the issue. The fact is that the death penalty is not demonstrably deterrent. It certainly isn't reformative. It's fiscally irresponsible, and frankly, there's a great deal of evidence to suggest that it's racist.
Yeah. Let's try and unpack each of those ideas, but I want to start first with the most obvious. We often think of our criminal justice system as a reform mechanism. And
correct.
Obviously, capital punishment doesn't reform the criminal, does it?
No, it doesn't. Time in prison does, and we know that because death penalty cases leave people in prison for a great deal of time, and during that time, we do hear of the occasional change of heart, but that only happened because they were given a long time in prison.
Yeah, an opportunity to think about what they did for 20 or 30 years.
Yes, and the irony of that is that if we carried out death penalties like so many people want them to be carried out, which is swiftly, that wouldn't happen at all.
Yeah. Let's take a look briefly at budget, at the financial impact. I'm not sure that this is in your area of expertise or if you've looked at data, but certainly the data I've seen suggests that it's much more expensive to have a criminal on death row and much more expensive to fight all of the appeals, etc., than it would be simply to house the criminal in a maximum security prison. Is that what you understand?
Yeah, that the cost of a trial exceeds the cost of housing somebody for 40 years in prison, and put that into context. Not every county is Manhattan. Not every county is Los Angeles. Not every county has really deep pockets. And so the funds that are being used to try and convict folks in death penalty cases is money that's not being spent on victim resources, is money not being spent on the quiet cases that affect so many more people.
What about the deterrent?
Well, deterrence is interesting because when you talk about deterrence, you're naturally talking about, a person's mind, their mindset. And I have many skills, but I am not a conjurer. I can't look into their mind and heart, but we can look at numbers. And so let's take a look at say, America's South. America's South is its most violent region. It has the most, murders. It also executes the most people, and so it's hard for us to say that it's a deterrent at all. That people somehow consider the crime and the punishment in the same breath. It simply doesn't bear weight. Is that the phrase I'm looking for? It doesn't bear out.
Yeah.
It doesn't hold weight, I guess. We have to struggle with that because, so far death penalty, isn't going to take away my pain. Death penalty isn't deterrent. It's not reformative. It's so expensive. What's it for then?
Yeah. Well, it is intended to be the ultimate punishment, right? It is intended to bring closure to the victims' families. And that's why it's interesting to talk to you, because you are a part of that group, right? You represent, certainly not all, I don't mean you represent, but you are one of the family member of a murder victim of a heinous crime. And yet you hold this view. What would you say if you were confronted by a weeping, wailing sister to another one of his victims, and she's saying, "We've got to execute this horrible man"? What would you say to bring comfort and solace at the same time you try to defend your position that the death penalty is not the right answer?
Well, Brene Brown would say that I don't say anything and that I just sit there and listen. And I think that's important. But when the tears are dried, and I'm sitting down with this woman, why is it always women, right? It's always the mother. But when I'm sitting down with this person who's been affected by a brutal act, I can only say what my own experience is that you won't find closure with his death. You're confusing closure with vengeance. And I think that, full stop.
Yeah. How has this thread of your life, which has been there since, really her story, Kasee's story, began as you came into the world, as you became aware of the world, you saw your older sister experiencing difficult things, disappearing from the house, coming back, disappearing again, and then you saw the impact on your mother and your other siblings as she went, as this story slowly unfolded. How has that thread of your life impacted you?
I think that it has forced me to confront something that's hard. My own complicity in a world that made Gary Ridgway possible. Gary Ridgway may be rare, thank God. He's rare, but he's simply the pinnacle of an entire system that preys on women. And we see that, just recently in the Kavanaugh hearings. We've seen that, and the Me Too movement isn't happening because people want attention. The Me Too movement is because everyone in this country knows someone. How many thousands of people knew my sister? I think that's important.
It's rare. You can find a woman that can't identify with the Me Too movement at all. I've talked to a few who just insist it's never happened, anything like that has ever happened to them. I can think of 2 or 3.
Yeah. And that's wonderful. That's wonderful. It's never happened to them.
Yes. but yeah, most women can identify times when they have been sexually assaulted, or they have been at least, they've been received cat calls, they have received some form of sexual harassment at the office. Yeah. It is an interesting extreme case of the Me Too movement where there is absolute silence, right? If you are the murder victim of a sexually based crime, you're not on social media.
No.
The hashtag Me Too doesn't work for you, right? Kasee's not here to tell her story.
No.
Because she is the extreme example of Me Too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to kind of circle back to something I said earlier. I talked about how we have to move, that our my apologies. We turned off everything except my phone. I want to circle back to something I said at the beginning. If we're ever to get past this, our desire for a blood-soaked justice, to grow in a way that, is more than simply a sum of our animal passions, we have to re-examine our relationship to the death penalty. And that is a part of the larger puzzle that the Me Too movement is part of, right? When, our history is filled with, men taking what they want, often from the women around them, gratifying their needs at the expense of the souls and the spirits of their victims. And so wanting the mankind and the men of our world to outgrow their animal instincts is both an important part of the Me Too movement and an important part of the movement to abolish the death penalty.
What do you do now to honor Kasee's legacy?
I speak out for the women in my life. I speak out against violence of all sorts. I speak out for children and the homeless. I guess Kasee made me a bit of an activist.
Yeah.
In a book that I'm writing, I wrote oh my word, the words, I lost words. I wrote the dedication, and I spoke of my sister, who is the one who taught me to weep. And not just for her, and not just for my own loss, but to weep generally, to feel deeply.
Yeah. I guess it's important, Christian, and before we wrap up, to acknowledge that not all sexual violence, and certainly Kasee was a victim of that, it's apropos of this topic that not all victims are women. In fact, men and trans individuals are certainly victims of sexual violence as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad you mentioned trans individuals. They're a silent, a group that have been silenced by society, and they are certainly victims, and men too. I've had my own brushes as an out gay man. I've been in situations where I've been accosted, and it's bewildering. It's so disorienting. But yeah, I think it is important to understand that all people of all stripes experience violence and sexual violence.
Yeah. Well, Christian, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. This is such a painful topic that I feel a special gratitude to you for coming on and sharing your views. I want to acknowledge that victims who have a different view of the death penalty are certainly entitled to their views.
Absolutely.
And I don't wish, by not making this a debate, I don't wish to disrespect their experience. And I'm sure that isn't your objective either. But I wanted to have you on today to get your rather unique, or at least rare, perspective as a family member of a victim who opposes the death penalty. And I appreciate you sharing that. Maybe you don't want people to reach out to you. Maybe you don't want people to find you. If there's a place where people can find you and you want to interact, how and where would that be?
I'm on Facebook, like a billion other people. Reach out. I try to open my heart to folks who need to reach out. I'm not a therapist, but I listen.
Excellent. Well, Christian, thank you very much for being with us today, and we wish you all the best, both to you and to all of your family members.
Thank you.
All righty. Let's do some good.
At Caring Crowd, we believe everyone has the power to make a difference. Through our crowdfunding platform for community health, we empower passionate people to drive real change. Whether you work for a nonprofit organization, volunteer, or want to get involved for the first time, you can post a campaign on Caring Crowd. Join us, because caring is where change begins.
Thank you for listening. Devin Thorpe's mission is to end extreme poverty, improve global health, and mitigate climate change before 2045 by finding and sharing the stories of those who are doing the most good. You can join with other listeners to accelerate Devin's mission by visiting helpdevin.org right now.